Hello, I'm Whalley. Welcome to Lenscraft. Today I'm doing a head-to-head between two popular photo editing packages, and I'm doing this not across all their tools, but I'm focusing on one of my favourite effects, which is the Orton effect, and I'm going to be using this image to demonstrate. Now the image has already been processed in Capture One, and I've then made further adjustments using the Knit collection. I'm at a stage now where I think that the Orton effect could add something to this image, because I'm finding the rocks in the foreground just a little bit sharp, and I want to emphasise that lovely hazy feeling in the distant hills. The two packages I'm going to be comparing for this are On1 Photo RAW 2020 and Luminar 3. I'm starting the comparison in Luminar 3. And the first thing I'm going to do is add a new empty layer to the adjustment. And in this layer I'm going to add the filter. Now in theory Luminar 3 should have this competition sewn up. It has an Orton Effect filter. Now the filter gives you quite a lot of adjustment, and it has two different types of Orton Effect. We'll look at the difference in a moment. So to start with, I'm just going to push the amount up to quite a high level, and straight away I can see a very realistic Orton effect created. Now one of the things I don't like too much about this Orton effect is that it's actually filling in the shadows and making them quite dark. So I could actually reduce the contrast, and that seems to clear up the blocking up of the shadows, and it still gives me a realistic nice effect. And I can also up the softness. Now the way to think of the softness is, watch these highlights here that you see on the rock. They're quite well defined when I have the softness at 0. If I push the softness up, they become more diffused and they tend to blend with the surroundings a little bit more. So that's a nice control that we've got. We can also push the brightness up on this, but to be honest I don't really want to do that. Contrast, as I say, will reduce the contrast or increase it depending on what you want to do. So setting of around 18 looks quite good, and you can increase or decrease the saturation as well on this layer. Let's try switching to the other type of Orton effect that we have. Now that one straight away doesn't have as much contrast. It doesn't seem to block up the shadows to the same degree, so I may actually increase the contrast very slightly on this. Again, the smoothness seems to smooth out the highlights and blend them with the surrounding area, so it's almost like a halo control. Now for me that isn't quite an Orton effect. It doesn't seem to have that traditional Orton look about it, but it gives a nice softening effect. It's more of a soft focus. So I'm going to switch back to type 1. That seems to give the best results. I'm going to reduce the contrast back down because I don't want my shadows blocking up. I'm going to just increase the softness slightly, and I'll push the amount up just to increase the softening. Now that's given me a very nice traditional looking Orton effect that I like. Let's now go and take a look at On1 and see what that can do. Here we have the image open in On1 2020. To create the Orton effect I'm going to first switch to the effects panel. Now in the effects panel you can add different filters. Now On1 doesn't have a specific Orton effect. Instead it's got a glow feature. Now the glow filter that is applied is quite similar to the Orton effect in what it produces. So what you can do is just create the effect with the amount slider, and also you can use the halo slider. Now the halo slider is what really produces the glowing effect by softening the highlights. So if you watch the highlights on the rocks again, as I push that higher you'll see that they go from being quite well defined to quite blurred. And the amount just controls the strength of the effect. Now as I push this up you'll notice that the adjustment does block up all the shadows, which is one of the problems I had over in Luminar. The third part of the control we've got here is this blending mode, and at the moment it's set to soft light. Now you can change that to have different effects. So for example you can lighten the image, and if I turn that on and off you can see that it has a glowing effect whilst lightening at the same time very slightly. We can also darken, we can multiply, which makes everything much darker, use screen to really lighten areas, and then you've got the more traditional overlay and soft light. Now I like soft light and also soft light strong, and it really just creates a slightly different effect. The problem I've got with this image is where I now push the sliders higher to create a stronger glowing effect, I also block up the shadows. So this adjustment on its own, whilst it's really good and effective, it's quite difficult to control it and create the sort of look that you got very easily with Luminar 3. If I adjust the opacity of the layer down, you can get a little bit more control over it, but it tends to reduce the softening effect at the same time. The better alternative with On1, as with a lot of these packages, is to start to use some form of masking. Let's add a mask to this and see what we can control. The masks are added by clicking this icon here, and you can see we've got a white mask. So what that's doing is it's allowing the effect to be seen across the entire image. The way that I'm thinking about this image is that I want a luminosity mask, and the reason for that is I want to block the effect from the shadows whilst allowing it to be seen in the highlights. So if I just click the luminosity button, that's created a luminosity mask for me. The effect's still there, but it's now been substantially reduced. If I turn it off, you can just about see it. And that may mean that we have to push up the effect higher and also increase the halo slightly. Now that's created a rather nice look. Just check it. Now whilst I like this, I think we can probably do more to refine the mask and give ourselves a better effect. One of the good ways to do this is with this levels adjustment that works on the mask. If I turn the mask onto view so you can see it, what we can do is now move the levels adjustment for the black point over to the right. Now what that does is it restricts the mask in the shadow areas more. At the same time, we want to make these areas that are sort of midtones lighter, and we can do that first by getting the white point and dragging that over, so that lightens these areas, and then we get the midtone slider here and we just move that over to the left, and that opens up these areas that may not have been getting as much of the effect. If I click the view button again, you'll see what we've now got. And that's created quite a nice effect in terms of where we were previously. If I turn it off and turn it back on, you can see that it's not having the darkening effect on the shadows to such a great degree. It's also softening the rest of the image in a really nice way. And this is now, in my opinion, a better look than Luminar 3 was giving. And that's purely because of the masks. I can probably refine the masks a little bit further. The density slider, for example, would bring the blacks back into the adjustment, and the reason for doing that is, if I go back to the mask, you can see that it will lighten the shadow areas. I could also use the feather adjustment to just blur these areas and blend them in a little bit further if I want to. So go back to the adjustment and you can see that really is quite a good look at this stage. So having used a mask in On1, it's only fair to go back to Luminar 3 and see what we've got there in terms of masking tools that could help refine the Orton effect further. I'm now back in Luminar 3, and this time I want to look at what masking tools I've got available. In Luminar, the masks are attached to each of the filters individually. So in the Orton effect, we can access the masks by clicking this paintbrush here. This gives you a little drop down that allows you to choose the type of mask that you want. In this case, I'm also going to create a luminosity mask just as I did in On1. So that's the mask created, and immediately it's removed a lot of the effect from the image. If I turn the filter off, you can see the effect when I turn it back on. Now if I want to view the mask, this is where the problem comes in. I can't actually do that in Luminar, and that really is a bit of a limitation because I'd like to see how strong the mask was and then adjust it just as I did in On1, but I can't do that. This means I probably have to push the amount slider up to give this more strength, and possibly even the softness slider a further adjustment. That's achieved a better look, but I'm still not entirely happy. It is possible if I was to select, for example, the radial mask or the brush mask, that gives me an option of additional masking tools. And once I'm in there, I've got this option to turn on the mask, so I can now see the luminosity mask that was created. If I think that wasn't quite strong enough in some areas, I could try to paint it in again. So select the option to paint in rather than erase. I'll set the opacity of the brush tool to around 40%. I've got quite a soft brush here. I'll just make sure that that's still quite soft. And now I can just paint over the areas that I want the effect to be seen in. Now I could continue to view the mask, but I don't actually like this red view of the mask. I don't think it's very helpful. So what I'll do is I'll return back to viewing the image. And now I'll see how I can just paint in the effect to be stronger in some of these areas. And I might paint in a little bit more just on these rocks here. And we'll just check that. And I think that's possibly a little bit strong, so I'll just reduce the amount slightly. And that looks now about right. Okay, so that's the adjustments done in both of the tools. Let's create an image to view them side by side, and then we'll make a decision about which is the best result. I now have both of the images I produced open in Photoshop, and I'm looking at them side by side. The image on the left is the On1 and the image on the right is the Luminar image. Now the first thing I notice is that the Orton effect on both of them is extremely similar, and I really can't at this stage tell the difference. If I think back to how I produced these, Luminar gave me much more control over the effect itself using the filter, whereas On1 was a fairly standard glow feature that I didn't have a lot of control over. The difference came in when I then started to use the masking tools. In On1, the masking tools were much more precise and gave me a lot more control in terms of how I could adjust the image. In Luminar, the masking tools were a little less refined, but still did an adequate job. Let's try and overlay the two images to better see the results. So the image I've got open at the moment is Luminar 3. If I go to On1, actually there is a slight difference, but it really can't be seen unless you switch between the two. What I'm seeing is that the definition here in the landscape is a little better in the On1 version, and that's probably because of the masking tools and the way I couldn't really do much to control the masking in the Luminar version. So overall, I would suggest that both of these tools produce an excellent Orton effect. On1 wins out simply because the masking tools are much better developed than in Luminar. I hope you've found this comparison useful. If you've got suggestions for future comparisons, not just with the Orton effect but with other filter effects, let me know and I'll see what I can do. I'm Whalley, you've been watching Lenscraft. I'll see you soon for another video.